Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Benedict Lecca, your friendly librarian here at the Redwood Library. And I'm very happy to see you all here this evening. We have a distinguished speaker and a fascinating topic, some honored guests, some more honored than others. No. Anyways, we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Sykes, who is a very accomplished scholar. Let me read you what I've looked up. She is a writer and editor focused on architecture and design, trained as an architectural theorist and historian. Krista crafts insightful stories about our everyday built environment. She lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and she's written a number of important books, including this book that she is presenting this evening, and also Constructing a New Agenda Architectural Theory, 1993 to 2009, and The Architecture Reader, Essential Writings from Vitruvius to the Present. And I should mention, of course, that we have a long engagement with architecture. Here we are in the signal structure of the American Enlightenment, and one of the five special collections areas, of course, is early modern architecture, decorative arts, and design. So this is definitely in our wheelhouse. So thank you, and I also want to welcome and thank the esteemed Ross Kahn, who has engineered this whole evening. So Ross, thank you and welcome.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ross Kahn, founding chairman of the Newport Architectural Forum and past president of the Yale Association of Rhode Island. Thank you very much to Dr. Benedict Lecca and the Redwood Library and Athenaeum for kindly agreeing to host this lecture and reception. That last part of the name is especially important, as this is not just a place for silent reading of books, but is a place for lively discussion and debate of important ideas. It's incidentally the first time I ever saw this building was in Dr. Scully's lecture hall along with 400 other people. To that point, I am pleased to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Krista Sykes. She earned her undergraduate degree at Princeton with high honors and received her doctorate in architectural history and theory from Harvard University, which some of you may know. She is now an independent researcher and scholar, but has taught at RISD, the Boston Architectural Center, and other institutions in the past. She was a staff writer at Contract Magazine and has been published, as Benedict pointed out, in many other publications. Vincent Scully was born in New Haven, Connecticut, and matriculated at Yale as a precocious 16-year-old scholarship student in 1936. He spent, with the important exception of several years as a soldier in Europe and the Pacific during World War II, basically his entire 97 years living, learning, and teaching in New Haven in and around Yale University. In his popularity and longevity as a teacher, he became, for many, the embodiment of teaching at Yale. So how is it that a woman educated at Princeton and Cambridge has come to study and document the life and career of Vincent Scully instead of a Yalie? Perhaps in the same way that it took a young scholar from New Haven to first recognize the importance of the shingle style, which was born and first evolved here in Newport. It took a non-Yale scholar like Dr. Sykes to recognize that Vincent Scully was not just the great teacher that we Elis may have taken for granted, but a very important architectural and urban philosopher and theorist worthy of study in his own right. I found Dr. Sykes's biography to be extremely illuminating and informative about a person I thought I already knew well. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Krista Sykes to Newport to share her valuable insights on Professor Vincent Scully.
Thank you, Benedict and Ross and Redwood Library and Athenaeum for hosting, as well as, I mean, this is great, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. I heard a Princeton woo-woo somewhere. I know there's at least one or two of us out there. All right, cool. Well, all right, so if you talk to anyone who attended Yale, especially between the years of 1949 and 2009, chances are good that they've heard of Vincent Scully. Chances are almost as good that they've had him as a professor. Are there any former students here? I've already talked to a few. Yeah, he taught more than 50,000 people in his lifetime. I mean, that's just mind-blowing. So I'd expect at least a few of you are here, so we're good. And in fact, within the Yale ecosystem, Scully maintains a strong presence, despite the fact that he's no longer physically with us. Beyond Yale, in the fields of architectural history and architecture, Scully was similarly well known for a number of decades. This is no longer quite the case today, and I believe there are a number of reasons for this, all having to do with the fact that he was a different kind of academic, one we rarely see, especially in today's highly specialized landscape. But to fully appreciate Scully and his contributions to architecture and culture at large, I feel like we need to retrain our collective focus to understand the lessons he still has to impart. That would take a while, so for time's sake, I'm just going to focus on one tonight, one lesson that Scully, I believe, still holds for us, and that is his embodiment of a both-and mindset. So, unlike many of you, I was not Scully's student. Rather, I first encountered him in a library. I was a sophomore at Princeton. I was studying architecture, and in the library, this guy was everywhere I looked. He had written books on architects from Frank Lloyd Wright through Michael Graves. He had written on architecture from ancient Greece through 20th century American urbanism. And I was intrigued to find one person who was writing about so many diverse topics. So naturally, I just wanted to read everything I could get my hands on. And that was a pretty easy thing to do because I was immediately struck by the emotionality that his writing conveys. And that isn't something that I still can find often in academic writing. So anyway, these explorations soon led to my college thesis, senior thesis, which gave me the opportunity to interview Scully in his Coral Gables home in Florida. Also present were his wife, Catherine Lynn, Tappy is her nickname, and Aldo, their Siberian Husky. That was 97. And then early 2000s, fast forward a few years, I'm in graduate school, and graduate school at Harvard, and Scully's work featured prominently in my dissertation. So then a few years after that, I'm out of graduate school. I decide I'm going to write a book on Scully. I reach out again. He says, of course, come meet me again. This time it's at his house in New Haven, Connecticut. Again, Tappy and Aldo are there, and it's 10 years later. However, the book soon took a back seat for me. I moved away from academia to focus on writing about architecture for designers and publications. I had 2 young kids, and I still nonetheless was kind of stirring this book idea in my mind. It never left me. And for the next decade, I still felt the pull to understand Scully's work in a way that I had yet to do. And then I got the news that on November 30th, 2017, Vincent Scully passed away at the age of 97 due to complications from Parkinson's disease. So without hesitation, I dug out my notes, my recorded interviews. I mean, some of these are 20 years old now, and I just knew with absolute certainty that I was going to write this book. Problem was I had absolutely no idea what this book was going to look like anymore, right? And what I did know is that for 2 decades, I had been fascinated by this man's work, and I really needed to understand, figure out why. So the next steps happened pretty quickly. I waited a few weeks and then reached out to Tappy and said, Tappy is his wife of almost 40 years, and said, hey, could I interview you again? And she said, oh, by all means, if you're willing to come to Lynchburg, Virginia, which is where she grew up and where she and Scully lived from 2009 on, once he had stopped teaching entirely. So I traveled down there in March 2018. This discussion in Tappy's dining room turned into a full-day affair. And as we're wrapping up, she mentions that she had an attic full of her husband's papers. So you could imagine I just start salivating. Yeah, my mind is blown. Turns out when she says she had papers up there, Scully, he wasn't the most organized sort, anyone who interacted with him. And this was exacerbated by multiple moves throughout his lifetime. So when she said papers, what she meant was papers jumbled with mementos and personal effects, and she wanted to go through everything and donate the papers proper to Yale. And I didn't even pause. I just, I'll help. And to my delight, she accepted. So the next month, just a couple weeks later, I returned to Lynchburg. I stayed with Tappy at the house for 4 days, and I would repeat this pattern for about a half dozen times over the next 2 years. Travel down, work with Tappy side by side to catalog and contextualize the left behind materials. Now my kids called it something else. Mom, you're gonna go clean Scully's attic again? And I mean, in a way we were, but we were really doing a lot more. By day, we were sifting through what we took to call the papers. And at nights, I'd have dinners with Tappy. Sometimes her friends would join us, her and Vince's friends, and I got to hear stories about Vince and learn about him in a way I wouldn't have been able to during his lifetime. So, I know you're wondering what we found in this attic. And here, I must thank Tappy for not minding that I'm showing a room full of people, her attic, a picture of it. However, this is pretty much the majority of this stuff were his papers and things like this. Cardboard boxes, dozens of them, plastic crates, rusty filing cabinets. There was a locked suitcase, we couldn't find the key. I can pick locks, it turns out. Anyway, so all this, and then there's boxes. This doesn't even count the boxes of photographs, negatives, slides. I mean, a gold mine. So essentially, what we found was a life in scraps of paper. They included handwritten manuscripts from many of his books, hand-drawn elementary school notebooks illustrating the American Revolution from 3rd grade, lecture notes from throughout the decades, holiday cards from same span, parking tickets from New Haven in the early 1950s. I mean, you name it, it was in there. And so materials from all stages of his life and his career. So at this point, I'd like to pause and quickly, take a sip of water, but also rehearse. I think it's worth going through the trajectory of Scully's work, because while many of us know him from one area, like teaching, or one area of study, we're in Newport, so the shingle style, it's worth explicitly tracing his main subjects of inquiry, because it allows me to do two things that make Scully a different kind of academic. I won't spill this on the computer, I promise. First is what he worked on. He did not focus on just one area of study, as we often see others do, especially today. Rather, his investigations spanned millennia, continents, civilizations. And then second, it's the way in which he worked on these subjects in a way that was very unique to him. And specifically, I've noticed that by the early 1950s, Scully had established a pattern of working as an historian and a contemporary critic. And this manifests as him exploring an historic topic alongside a contemporary one. Contemporary for his present day. And furthermore, throughout the second half of the 20th century, we find that he often had a hand in pivotal architectural events. And we see him actively mentoring, befriending, and even kind of supporting and championing specific contemporary architects. So this historic contemporary duality that I've identified as running throughout his career, it shows up pretty early during the late 1940s while he's in graduate school, with explorations of what he would codify and then name the shingle style, which I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, being in Newport, but essentially domestic wooden architecture of the late 19th century, the low house that we have up here on your left. I switch them when I'm lecturing always. Anyway, on this side, we've got the low house, which was kind of the quintessential shingle-style house for Scully. It became the crux and the shingle style itself of his dissertation, which he completed in 1949. And at the same time, though, he's looking to the contemporary work of Frank Lloyd Wright, who Scully identified Wright as a descendant of the shingle style. And here we're just seeing one of Wright's Usonian houses from the 30s. So this pairing of Wright and Scully, of shingle style and Wright, with this, we see that Scully wasn't content to simply, talk about and explore the past. Rather, he felt the need to link it to the present. And at this point, we also find a curious condition of Scully operating as an historian and a modernist, which, from our present vantage point, might not seem curious or remarkable. But in the 40s and 50s, modernism at that point was often presented as a rupture or deliberate break from the past. Whether it was or not is another conversation. But at that point, to have someone who is an historian looking to these, past architectural styles and events, and yet be a fully self-avowed modernist was pretty remarkable. So not only is he, with his words, calling himself a modernist, you can see proof in his house. So he traveled in the late 40s out to Taliesin West, in the one in Wisconsin, to meet Frank Lloyd Wright. He and his first wife, Nancy, Scully and his first wife, Nancy, went. Scully remembers having quite a good interaction with Wright, although he angered Olga Vanna, who was Wright's wife, because Scully almost burnt down the house with his cigarette, apparently. So that didn't go over well. However, so Scully commissioned Wright to design a house for him and his young family, 3 sons and Nancy. And this is the house that Wright designed. Scully loved it, looked at the price tag, and thought, oh man, I can't afford this on my new professor's salary. So he paid Wright and said, I'm so sorry, I can't build it. Wright's apprentices made fun of him and said things like, oh, you commissioned a champagne house on a beer budget. And Scully never forgot that. But so he goes back and designs his own house, one that he can afford to build. And this is what it looks like. It's in Woodbridge, still there now, today. And to design this house, Scully drew on other popular modernist houses of the time. Most specifically, Johnson's glass house, Philip Johnson's, which is 35 miles south of where Scully's house is located. And we can see that the houses share a couple really obvious similarities, right? First being their shape. They're both rectangular, but whereas Johnson's house is sheathed in plate glass, completely transparent. Scully's house, you can see he uses a combination of these diagonal wooden elements that he borrowed from Marcel Breuer, who was doing houses in that kind of idiom on the exterior, as well as plate glass. This would keep the cost down for Scully, and arguably it's a smarter choice for a Connecticut winter than a full glass house. So another thing they share, though, and this is worth noting, you can see in Johnson's house, this is an open plan, right? You have this, the only enclosed feature there is the mechanical spaces in the bathrooms. And Scully did a similar thing with his house. No walls in this joint, except for around the mechanical and the bathroom. And then you have the kitchen tucked in here behind the fireplace. So all of the spaces were delineated by these mobile partial height partitions, these bookshelves. That includes the bedrooms. His kids were like between 8 and 13 at this point. 3 boys. So Scully quickly learned that while such an open plan layout might work for a single adult living in Johnson's house, for example, and even that is kind of arguable, according to stories I've heard, it does not fly with a family of, adolescent boys who are increasingly blasting rock music that their father hates. So that was a problem. But he's such a modernist, he built this house for his family, right? Around the same time, following his work on the shingle style in this house, in the mid to late 50s, we see Scully turn to Greek sacred architecture as his kind of more historic topic, and modern architecture, specifically the work of Louis Kahn, as something he's looking at in the present day. Greek architecture, specifically of the classic and archaic periods. It's worth, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with Kahn's first major commission that is the first modern building on Yale's campus. Worth noting that Kahn and Scully became good friends. They were both teaching at Yale in the late 40s, and Scully remained there, and Kahn did through the 50s. Scully wrote the first book on Kahn's work, and in fact, between 1960 and 1962, he published 4 books, Scully did. That's just wild. 3 of them were on modernist topics, and 1 was on Greek sacred architecture. And we have this image here, the Temple of Hera 2. Scully took that image, and that was the frontispiece for that book on Greek sacred architecture. So around this time, though, in the early to mid-60s, we start to see a shift in Scully's approach to modernism. Specifically, he becomes more disillusioned with certain aspects that he finds problematic with modern architecture. For example, the impact of urban renewal on his beloved hometown of New Haven, where we see entire neighborhoods, such as this was a neighborhood, and now it is the Oak Street connector and parking lot. Entire neighborhoods were eradicated to make way for highways and sanitized housing projects. And this wasn't only obviously going on in New Haven. Scully saw what he understood as an anti-historicism or a destruction of the past and place that was going on both in New Haven and other places. Like, for example, in Athens, this first image, we're standing on the Parthenon here, looking across to what Scully termed the sacred mountain, Mount Hymettos, and he took great umbrage with this building right here, which is the Athens Hilton, which is just kind of dropped, and he felt it was really interrupting the connection between the Parthenon and its sacred landscape feature. He wasn't quiet about his displeasure. He actually wrote an article that was called "The Athens Hilton, A Study in Vandalism." So, and he saw similar vandalism going on in the U.S. At Park Avenue, for example, where Walter Gropius and a few other architects, their Pan Am building, similarly looks like this, slab was just dropped, and Scully argued it visually dead-ended the flow down toward Grand Central Station, down Park Avenue, and around. This one, he wrote an article called "The Death of the Street." So he was, very vocal about what he saw as historic fabric being vandalized by these structures that overwhelmed and, if not completely disregarded, their specific sites and contexts. So we see Scully becoming critical of modernism in a way that he wasn't before. And again, not too surprisingly for us at this point, he pairs historic and contemporary subjects for investigation. He looks to the pueblos of the American Southwest, as well as other indigenous architectures of Mesoamerica. In the pueblos, he saw them as establishing a relationship, much as the Parthenon had, with their landscape features. So we can see in the Taos Pueblo here, he felt that the pueblo, instead of contrasting with its natural environment, as he saw the Parthenon and other Greek temples to do, he felt that the pueblos worked to blend in with it. So they were echoing, not confronting, their landscape. And meanwhile, he is looking at the work in his present day of Robert Venturi. And here we have kind of Venturi's first, one of his early completed commissions, A House for His Mother, because he, like most good architects with willing family, funded his initial forays into built designs. And in Venturi's House for His Mother, Scully recognizes a range of traditions that Venturi is drawing on, and Venturi presents them as all valid sources of inspiration. It's worth noting that Scully and Venturi, much as Scully had with Kahn before, Scully and Venturi become friends, and Scully very much supports Venturi in many ways. So in the early 1970s into the 1980s, we see Scully looking back to an early love of his, which is Gothic cathedrals. He wanted to study them in the 50s, but didn't have the money to do so, couldn't go overseas. So he, or at that point, late 40s, early 50s. So he turns to Gothic cathedrals, but he doesn't stop with Gothic cathedrals. He just barrels right on through for a couple hundred more years, up through Baroque gardens. So does this long, protracted study for that period of time. Meanwhile, he is very enamored of the work of Aldo Rossi, the Italian architect, who draws on a panoply of historic and vernacular forms to create his contemporary designs. As Scully had before with Kahn and Venturi, he becomes good friends with Rossi, to the point where, remember that beautiful dog we saw in the beginning? Aldo, he is named after Aldo Rossi. Yeah, it's sweet and a little poignant because Rossi died in a car accident in '96, and Tappy and Vince named their new puppy after him, Aldo. Yeah. So moving into the 90s, Scully he turns his attention to new urbanism, which is a movement spearheaded by his former students, Andreas Giovanni and Elizabeth Platter-Zyberk, who incidentally he became good friends with as well, who they, in the early 70s, were his students at Yale and absorbed Scully's lessons on traditional urban forms. Anyone who was in Scully's architecture or urbanism classes, I'm sure, has seen this 9-square grid that anchored the development of New Haven in the 1600s, from which it grew. So the early 1960s, Scully visits Seaside. I'm sorry, wrong date entirely. Early 1990s, Scully visits Seaside, which is hailed as the first new urbanist development. It's centered on pedestrian, community, as more so than the automobile. It's kind of designed for walkability and community. And this is a movement that Scully then supports for the remaining 25 years of his life. So in the attic, we find remnants of all of these eras. And they point to something rare. Not just this broad scope of Scully's work, but more so his ability to change his mind, which isn't something we often see academics do, I have to say. In Scully's case, he's unapologetically a modernist, and yet within a decade, he becomes very critical of certain aspects of modernism. And I personally had always wondered about this shift, the process behind this shift in thought. And we found something in the attic that, for me, helped explain it. People magazine, 1975, the October issue. Scully was showcased as one of the country's 12 great professors. With this image appeared, and I just love this image, he's got such swagger here, right? With this image appeared a profile that was originally part of a longer piece that the author, Marcia Cochran, had sent to Scully. She wanted him to see the whole thing that the editors had then chopped down for publication. So I hadn't seen the full thing before, and I was scanning through it, and I was really struck by a quote that hadn't made it into the final version. The quote, Scully said, "My life started over in the 1960s," Scully admits. "I had to think through and out of the existential, confrontational view I developed in the 1950s. It turned me around." Wait a minute, I thought. Scully's views on architecture changed in the 1960s as well, so his outlook on life and architecture changed around the same time. So together, that kind of thought and this quote established for me a conceptual framework through which I could understand Scully's shift in focus during the early to mid-60s. And furthermore, the quote offered a concept that would guide my understanding of Scully as an historian, as a critic, and as a human being. And namely, that's the idea of shifting from an existential, confrontational view to a gentle, accommodating one. And now I'd just like to spend the rest of our, kind of my portion of this talk, looking at what in the 1960s such a shift would mean in terms of architecture. So, a little mini architectural history lesson. So, in the decades following World War II, well into the 1960s, buildings were often designed to stand out. And very generally speaking, they typically could be said to fit into one of two categories. The first being the sleek glass box, perfectly exemplified by the Seagram building, which was designed by Mies van der Rohe and Philip Johnson, he of the Glass House a few minutes ago. And here we see the Seagram rising 39 stories, set back within its plaza. It's almost like a jewel on display. For our purposes, there are a few things I'd like to note. First, just looking at this building, the use, it's unclear, right? It could almost be anything. It could be high-rise apartment buildings, like Mies would design or had designed for Chicago a few years prior. Or it could be the headquarters of a Canadian beverage company, as it was. So second, with its 100-foot setback from the street and its stark vertical rise, the Seagram breaks up, it even kind of, you could say, it destroys the line of the street. Furthermore, it's kind of aloof. It's standoffish even with its neighbors, which leads me to the third thing, which is, I think we can safely call this an object building. It's talking primarily about itself, right? So these three things, this sleek glass box, keep that in mind. And then the other architectural category, broadly speaking, the powerful masonry mass. Again, this one would be familiar, I think. This is the Art and Architecture building by Paul Rudolph, Yale's campus, with which I'm sure many of you are familiar. We see the Art and Architecture building rising 7 stories. It's this robust combination of shifting volumes, and it is comprised of poured-in-place concrete that was then hammered by hand to create this really rough texture on the exterior. Despite obvious differences, there are some similarities, believe it or not, to the sleek glass box. First, its use, it's unclear. It could be just about anything. It could be a parking garage. It could be a college dorm. It could be a government services center for Boston, like Rudolph would design in a couple of years. Or it could be a classroom building for art and architecture students at Yale, as it very much was. Second, it too breaks the line of the street. Not as dramatically as does the Seagram, but yet it doesn't uphold that stark line that the buildings surrounding it had previously kind of established, because with its jogs and juts forward and backward. And third, it too, again, perhaps not as much as Johnson's building, the Seagram building, we could say that it's an object building. Yes, at least the Rudolph's building has some nods to the neo-Gothic campus that it's neighboring, but it does kind of say, look at me. Yet while we see the sleek glass box as being aloof, we can say that the sleek glass box, it's aloof, but the masonry mass, that thing's aggressive now, and especially if you're wearing any kind of knit material. Do not lean against it. Bad move. Scully himself would later describe these design tendencies as doctrinaire purism and titanic structural agonies. Love those phrases. So despite their differences, both of these buildings, in their own ways, were designed to stand out. We can understand them as two sides of the same coin, exemplifying the existential confrontational mentality. So this is the kind of architecture and variations on the two that Scully would have been seeing throughout the early 1960s. And then in 1965, he comes across an anomaly. The Guild House by Robert Venturi, Scully visits while it's under construction, the year before it's completed, yet enough of it is done for Scully to see that despite looking somewhat ordinary, this building for him is extraordinary. Before I get into Scully's interpretation of the Guild House, I'd just like to give you a few quick details about the building. It's funded by the Quaker Friends organization. It's low-income housing for elderly members of the neighborhood who wanted to remain in this Philadelphia neighborhood. So it contains 91 apartments, as well as a common room. The common room's up here, and 91 apartments throughout its 6 stories that a couple different layouts, depending. It's clearly red brick, and it has these metal sash windows, which in many modernist circumstances were a big no-no. The windows actually open here, and different sizes, different configurations, but something to note about the entrance, the white glazed brick draws our attention to the entrance, as does this really massive polished granite column, black granite, that contrasts with the white. Also, the facade does uphold the street line, even as its sides of the building, the massing steps back away. You can see kind of more over here. And furthermore, the facade itself reads very much like a billboard. You can see it's thin. It's almost two-dimensional. And that's reinforced, its applied kind of nature, it's not structural, is reinforced by these notches up top that allow us to see the daylight filtering through. So you very much get the sense this is an applied front to billboard. There is a literal sign. There is no ambiguity what's going on here. This is the Guild House. And there is a gold TV antenna that crowns the building. It is not functional, rather it is symbolic, and Venturi, with what he would always refer to as his kind of ironic take on things, says it's a nod, a non-judgmental nod toward the main pastime of its occupants' main kind of they watch TV. It's basically what he was saying, which is, anyway. So in the Guild House, though, Scully sees architecture working on multiple levels at once. So first, and here I'm referencing Scully's commentary on the project, he sees the Guild House as fitting in with its immediate Philadelphia neighborhood and drawing on its context. So this is, I unfortunately don't have an image from exactly when the Guild House was constructed, but so just to situate us here, this is Spring Garden Street, same view more or less, down the same street, east toward the river in Philadelphia. To situate us, we have this here, this Philadelphia Belting Company, is this right here. And this is from the 70s. We can see the Guild House right here. So if we had the site in the building, in this 1930s image, it would be somewhere around here, a block down or so. And the context that the Guild House was put, in which was built, would be something closer, I think, to the 1930s view, because by the 70s we have a Sunoco over here, and there's a lot more that has been taken down. But we can see that, the neighborhood itself was pretty much low-rise, max 5-6 stories. It was a mixed-use, commercial and residential. Edgar Allan Poe's house when he lived in Philly is just around the corner from this place. And you can see that the Guild House echoes with its height, its materials, as well as the use of double-hung windows, its immediate neighborhood. Another thing to draw your attention to is this building right here is the Northern Savings Fund building by Furness, the Philadelphia architect Frank Furness. And Scully sees a similarity here in the massing. So the Guild House, in its massing and symmetry, echoes the Furness building, but instead of using these masonry elements to delineate bays that build toward the center. The guild house uses the building's massing itself that build toward this central entrance area, the central facade. So, and these are just two of the immediate contextual kind of references that Scully mentions. So he also sees the guild house as containing other influences from both historical and contemporary sources. Just quickly, he looks to the work of Le Corbusier and calls out the Villa in Le Chaux de Fonds, which has, oh, sorry, I'm hitting the wrong thing. This blank facade that is framed by these smaller windows, and you can see an echo of that kind of layout in the guild house. Another Corbusier house, the Villa Savoie, the strip windows of the guild house, they come in here almost as a foil to the square windows, but these echo the ribbon windows that are used by Corbu and other modernists in any number of modernist projects. Scully also sees in the great European housing projects of the teens and 20s some references that Venturi draws upon. For example, in Van der Klerk's complex in Amsterdam, Scully sees two design moves, first being this squat column right here that Venturi echoes both scale and proportion and placement, right? It draws your eye to the entrance. At the second, the use of the water line where it delineates the ground level here, and Venturi uses a similar technique for the guild house. Also, the Karl Marxhof in Vienna from the late 1920s, Scully sees both architects operating on multiple levels at once, working with multiple scales. For example, in the Karl Marxhof, we have this large arch that signifies this communal entry point, and it's juxtaposed with these smaller windows that correspond to the units behind. And you have a similar thing, you could say, going on in the guild house with the communal arch for or the arch for the community space, the communal gathering space, and then the individual units having smaller windows. As well, if you look at the bays, one bay of the Karl Marxhof, you can read it almost as an inversion of that Venturi uses, with the arch down here becoming the arch up there. And then finally, you have the flagpole turns into the TV antenna, right? So, and for Scully, he aligns this TV antenna with pop art. And he sees speaking of pop art, he sees in the Guild House sign a nod to the super graphics of the 1960s. And furthermore, he sees the whole facade as a sign, as a billboard, as in some ways echoing what Michelangelo does 400 years prior with the Porta Pia. Both of these architects gesture that the facade is surface. You can see not only the thin kind of line of the facade as it rises up here, as Venturi does as well, but Michelangelo uses these crenellations that, again, appear like two-dimensional, and Venturi is using his notches up top, all to signify that this is not structural, rather applied. It's more like a billboard. So in the Guild House, Scully finds an accommodation of context, history, and of present experience. And it's not fighting, it's not confronting, it's not annihilating anything. Rather, it's attempting to work with what is, instead of holding out for what should be. It comes down to a focus on the real instead of an ideal. And for Scully, this proves revolutionary. So by the early 1960s, Scully realizes that modern architecture, and he in his own life, has been pushing for an ideal. Existential, confrontational, I know the way things should be, an either-or approach. And he has a revelation that what he and architecture and even society need is a shift to the real. Gentle, accommodating. There are many ways that things can be. A both-and approach. And I think there's something valuable about Scully's shift from the ideal to the real. namely that he's open to the complexities of life and the idea that nothing is straightforward, and that he's willing to embrace this both-and mindset. I'd like to conclude with an image of a memorial that was commissioned following Scully's death by the artist Gaia. It wasn't commissioned by him, it was completed by the artist Gaia and commissioned at Seaside. Here we see a portrait of Scully. He is presiding over insignias of his beloved Yale as well as University of Miami, where he taught in the remaining 2 decades of his life. And despite all of the detail, what strikes me most is his expression. He's thoughtful, he's contemplative, I'd even say it's reflective. And I like to think that Scully's expression is tied to this transition that we just explored from the ideal to the real, and that it maps to a concept that Scully prized above all. Architecture, he said, shows us who we are and who we want to be. By the mid-1960s, Scully came to understand what he wanted to be, and he turned to what he saw as a more kind, humane architecture to make that happen. So I am happy to take questions, to entertain stories, anything of that nature. Thank you for listening to that. Okay. Yes.
Krista, what, if you dare to say, was the single most surprising or wonderful thing that you found in the attic in Virginia?
Oh dear, that's a very good question. There were so many things. I really did enjoy finding the parking ticket from High Street, because that was just like, really, do you ever throw anything away? Come on. But I really enjoyed some of the notebooks. Like, there's this whole piece, you could see what his 3rd grade teacher was trying to get him to do, like cutting out newspaper articles, and then he's illustrating them, so you have like Revolutionary soldiers next to like stuff that's going on in the 1920s. I think there was a Suez Canal, like like all sorts of cool stuff. So it was, there's not just one thing, there were many, many cool things. But good question. Yes?
In his modern architecture course in the spring of 1967, I remember Scully spent a good part of one lecture talking about the progression, which I think he even referred to as a conversation, on Chapel Street in New Haven, starting at High Street
Yes.
with Street Hall, which was the old headquarters of the History of Art Department, and was built, I suppose, in toward the end of the 19th century.
Yeah, 18-something.
And then
90s,
progressing
80s.
across the street, there was a bridge that went over, and the next building was the original University Art Gallery, which was probably built in the early 20th century.
Yes.
And then the next building was Kahn's building, and then finally across York Street was Paul Rudolph's building. And Scully presented, I think, a very coherent argument for how this progression worked. And as I said, I think he referred to it as a conversation even, but the notion of the transition into Kahn's horizontal thrusts.
Yes.
And then across the street, the Rudolph building that sort of pushed it all up. I just wondered if you encountered anything in your exhaustive research on that subject.
He definitely, the phrase you're using, conversation, I've came across a lot. A conversation, architecture is a conversation across generations, and I think that is very much speaking to what you're saying. Like in as you know, Kahn's building is picking up on the floor lines from the the 1920s building that's right there, the art history.
The old
and
art
then,
gallery.
yeah, exactly. And I think, and I think that's a theme that comes up throughout all of the work he looks at, whether it's in, I mean, I think there's a conversation amongst like in a site like on that street, for example, of the buildings marching on. But also, I think part of his genius was being able to look at something going on in, 500 BCE Greece, and then see an analog in the 1300s and the Pueblos, and then to that an analog in, maybe New York City in the mid-1900s. So I feel like the conversation across generations can be pointed to in any number of his investigations. If that makes any sense? So, thank you.
I was just going to ask a question of a book, which is Newport Architectural Heritage. And of course, as you know, is the collaboration between Antoinette Downing and Vincent Scully, and first published in 1952. And of course, we, living in Newport, embrace it greatly. And so I just wanted to ask the question as to the research that we really hold most highly, which is his introduction in the nomenclature of stick style, as well as shingle style. And as he progressed more into modernism, exploring postmodernism, can you explain a little bit about how he felt about the work that he had promoted or understood and coined, and how that evolved over time as well? Do you have any insights into that?
So to echo back, are you asking how he felt seeing the adoption of this shingle style and stick style,
Yes.
and then replayed in the 1980s and such?
That's correct.
There are clips that have him saying things like, "Oh, this word postmodernism. Must they always tar me with this postmodernist brush?" Stuff like that, because he did feel like the idea of postmodernism was kind of anathema to him. To him, it was a conversation, like moving forward. It wasn't a separate. Post implies after. We're not after anything. It's just as valid as anything else. So I feel like I got the sense that he was quite proud, and actually he says that, right, in the Shingle Style Today, or the Historian's Revenge. Like, who would have known that this shingle style would have spawned like a whole new thing? I mean, like, I think that's really great, but I think then he also feels like it is misunderstood by some practitioners and taken to be just, it's not just an automatic kind of reproduction of historical detail in his mind. He likes to see there be more thought and reasoning behind that progression, if that makes any sense.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So yeah, thank you. Yes.
I was an art student the first year and my last year in Rudolph's building. And I hung around with architects who told me that the poured concrete for the surface was made from corrugated board.
Really?
And I never heard that it was hammered.
It was hammered by hand. And in fact, Scully's son, Dan, who is an architect, was an architecture student in the later 60s, 68, 69, at Yale. But beforehand, New Haven, he had applied to be one of the guys to chip by hand, and he didn't get that job. He was kind of bummed. But he did end up working in Louis Kahn's office in Philadelphia, so I think he was okay with that. Like he got a good deal. But
I think that's a great story.
yeah, I agree. Yeah, John.
What about the slides?
Yes.
Scully's thousands of slides. Were any of those in the attic? I mean,
Oh, yeah. Oh, there were so many slides. It was overwhelming, and it got to the point where we ran out of time, actually. So they were turned over with a lot of the papers to Yale. So they will, whenever it makes its way through the archiving process, I suspect they'll be associated with that. But we were grappling with COVID hit right as, we were kind of still trying to figure out everything. And in the end, I do wish I had more time to sort through, because while writing, it would have been helpful to see, because he actually was quite organized when he needed to be, like with his slides, for example, and with his books, you can see like the manuscripts, the way they were put together, extremely organized in those circumstances. So,
Please join me in thanking Krista one more time.
thank you.